Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the International Conference on Law and Economics 2021, Professor Ms. Malini, Tamil Nadu National University, welcome Professor Moderator V. Shantakumar for this event. I also welcome the other speakers here and also all the participants and everyone from TNNW as well. Today we have a roundtable discussion consisting of three speakers, namely Professor Amit Chauvin Ray, faculty JNU Delhi. And we also have Professor Ritu Diwan, President Indian Association of Women's Studies, and Professor Chinmay Tumbe, faculty IIMA. I firstly welcome today's moderator for this session, Professor V. Shantakumar. Professor V. Shantakumar is a professor of economics from Dasim Premji University, and his areas of interest and expertise includes.
You can be very short. You can be very short in my introduction. Please avoid it.
All right.
Because I think you can start introducing, I think, Professor Ray and other speakers. You can just read out.
All right, yes. So we have three speakers today. The first speaker for today's session will be Professor Amit Chauvin Ray, who will be addressing us on the topic, the pandemic, the public director of health, and revisiting the IPR debate. Professor Amit is a professor of economics at the Center for International Trade and Development from the School of International Studies in JNU Delhi, and his education is from the Presidency College Calcutta and at University of Oxford, from where he has received his doctorate of philosophy in economics in 1988. He was also elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, London in 2007. And he's also a member of the Independent Commission on Development and Health in India since 2008. During his 26 years of academic career, Professor Ray also has held teaching and research positions at premier universities and institutions.
I suggest you cut this out because let us move on to the discussions. That's more interesting.
I was just acting as
for me. I don't think you have to go into the elaborate details. Thank you so
much. Shall we suggest that we will invite the first speaker?
Yes, sir.
You can have the introduction later on for the other speakers. No, am I right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we should give the maximum time to the speaker. So I'm not taking any time. I'm inviting Professor Ray to make the presentation. And shall I suggest to Professor Ray to limit his speech to about 22 to 25 minutes so that we will get at least 5 minutes for questions? Am I right?
Sure. I'll try that. Yes. Am I audible? Am I audible to everybody?
You're audible, at least.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Shanta. It's very nice to see you after a long time. Heartiest greetings from Delhi, and thank you all the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak on a topic very close to my heart. Today I'm going to talk about the pandemic, the public character of health, and revisiting the IPR debate. What I'll do is I'll begin with defining very rudimentarily a public good. Then I'll sort of talk about health, although it's not a pure public good. How the pandemic has exposed the public character of health, and I would give four different reasons for that. And the final reason will actually lead me to the discussion on IPR, revisiting IPR in the context of the pandemic. So this is how I've decided to sort of divide the talk today. So let us begin with public good. Now, law and order is cited as a classic example of a pure public good in economics. It is non-rival in consumption. No matter how much it is used by some, the amount available for use by others remain intact. So once law and order is provided, it can be supplied to additional users at zero marginal cost. So if you provide law and order to 10 different citizens of the country, it doesn't cost you any more to provide it to 20 other citizens. So that's the whole idea of pure public good. One of them, it's non-rival. The second, so once provided, it can be supplied to additional users at zero marginal cost. Hence, charging a positive price would violate the standard efficiency assumption in economics, efficiency criterion in economics, equating price with marginal cost. Marginal cost being zero, you cannot charge anything but any positive price. And if you do so, you tend to exclude some users. So that's certainly suboptimal. Now, fortunately, pure public goods you can't even exclude because it is non-excludable. Once it is provided to one or two individuals, it is provided to all. So law and order, once you provide it to three individuals, you cannot exclude the other three, citizens from availing of the law and order enforcement services that is in place. So this leads to market failure. And economists from all paradigms, from all different temperaments, ideologies, tend to agree that the provision of pure public goods cannot be left to the forces of the market mechanism. So government in almost all nations assume the entire responsibility of providing law and order for safety and security of its citizens. If the state fails to provide law and order, no matter how much an individual spends on securing his or own house, belongings, your personal security guards while moving around, there would never be a complete sense of individual and collective safety, security, and freedom. We do not have to be too imaginative to visualize the plight of people living in areas ruled by bounty hunters and gangsters where the state law and order machinery has virtually collapsed. This often is depicted in movies and dramas. We have all seen that Texas movies, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, for a few dollars more, Sholay, Gangs of Wasseypur, Mirzapur. All these are examples where a public provision of law or order collapses, and there is no individual, no matter how rich you are, there is no individual safety and security. Now, health, so this is a pure public good, but health in this sense is not a pure public good. It is neither non-rival nor non-excludable as such. It's perfectly feasible to transact health in the market. Indeed, there is a roaring private sector presence in health the world over. After all, one cannot deny that good health depends to a large extent on individual choices and affordability. Unlike physical safety and security, which largely depends on law and order enforcement rather than your own actions. But here comes the twist. The pandemic, COVID-19, has exposed to all of us how a microscopic organism spreading to human contact can create havoc for human lives and livelihoods and pose an equally dangerous threat to the safety, security, and freedom of all citizens, no less dangerous than the absence of law and order. Health thus no longer remains constricted to individual domains. It becomes a matter of public health. Public health is defined as the health of the population as a whole, especially as the subject of government regulations and support. Any communicable disease that can spread through contact poses a public health challenge. And COVID-19 emerged as a highly contagious infection that spreads not only through direct and indirect touch, but also through droplets in the air near infected individuals. So no matter how much an individual takes care of his or her own health by buying quote unquote health services or health care from the market, there is precious little that one can do to protect oneself from getting infected by COVID-19. One can, of course, isolate oneself. That's one possibility to prevent from society, to prevent contagion. But social isolation is, of course, a luxury for the poor. And not even a foolproof system for the rich. We have seen how many celebrities, fell prey to COVID-19. Because, all of us need to live in society. We have to depend on others for our daily needs. So we must remember that COVID-19 did not spare celebrities in this respect. So this highlights an important public character of an apparently private good called health. Hence, the state must step in to prevent the spread of the virus during such health emergencies by imposing rules and restrictions on society. Without such collective public action, individual safety, security would be at stake in much the same manner as in the absence of state-provided law and order. So that's the first issue that exposed the public character of health. Now, second, once infected, there is no cure, but only treatment for the symptoms. This means one is dependent on medical care infrastructure for tiding over the illness. Again, this cannot be left solely to the market forces. The private healthcare sector would prove to be extremely inadequate in this regard. Why? Because private investors, when they invest in healthcare, they don't foresee the demand that comes from a pandemic where every other person is getting infected. They would need oxygen, they would need hospitalization. That's just simply not possible. So we have seen how the state responded by creating makeshift, medical treatment centers and all that, So again, you cannot relegate health. This exposes the second public character of health. When pandemic spreads its wings and infections reach a height, there could be an acute shortage of medical facilities if it's left solely to the private sector. However, from the public health perspective, it is crucially important to ensure that every infected individual is treated in the face of such contagious pandemics. Because if you leave untreated individuals, if you don't put them in isolation, this could pose major health threats to the entire society and community. So this can be ensured only by the state and not by the market. So presence of a strong and effective public health machinery is the only solution under such circumstances. It would invoke all government medical facilities and create temporary medical camps to overcome this shortage. The private sector can only supplement this effort, but can never take over the entire burden of treatment for all infected citizens, rich and poor. It comes to us as no surprise that a prosperous, advanced country like the USA, with scanty public health infrastructure, is among the worst hit by COVID-19. In the words of a Nobel laureate, Paul Krugman, I quote, America has the advanced world's most privatized, business-oriented healthcare sector. It also has by far the highest costs and some of the worst health outcomes. So another public character of health. The third public character of health is reflected through the impact of the COVID on the economy and livelihoods. We have seen how COVID-19 brought economic activities to a standstill, causing enormous damage to the national economy. Individuals lost their jobs and livelihoods, were pushed to the verge of starvation. Without state support through PDS, income transfers, or some such measures, there are no other ways to ameliorate the sufferings of the people caused by this pandemic. The tremendous hardship faced by the people for no fault of their own, not necessarily. It's because of the pandemic, their businesses are closing, everything is being shut down. This reflects strong negative externalities of COVID-19. Now, market solutions to tackle these negative externalities are nearly impossible to design and implement due to very high transaction costs. Thus, individuals' health or the lack of it at times of pandemic like COVID goes well beyond private well-being and produces far-reaching adverse consequences for the entire society. That's the third reason what I suggest as how COVID exposed the public character of health. And the final and the most important public character of health, which leads me directly to the IPR issue, stems from the quest for prevention and cure of infections like COVID. The pursuit of science for creating new knowledge to come up with possible vaccines and medications and prevent contagious diseases like COVID is a public good. This knowledge, creation of this new knowledge, is definitely a public good. The state must, therefore, I'll explain it a little more details in a minute. The state must therefore invest in health R&D rather than leaving it to the initiatives entirely of the initiatives of the private sector, so that the new vaccines and or treatment that is created will not be left to the market forces for its universal use. In fact, COVID-19 reveals that in a globalized world, contagion is not limited within national boundaries. The infection spreads like wildfire across the globe, exposing a global public character of health and health research. If public health does not get its due attention in any part of the world, it may cause frequent local health emergencies, and the ripples of it will be felt all over the world through global transmission. And this last point brings us, this last point about prevention and cure, creating new knowledge for prevention and cure, brings me to the final issue of today's presentation, where I would like to revisit the IPR debate in the context of the pandemic. Now, we all know that there is a demand for IPR waiver for COVID vaccines, and it has created huge controversy. On one hand, it is argued that IPR waiver will help mobilize additional manufacturers to produce more vaccines to bridge the gap and reduce the vaccine disparity. I mean, we are going to see very soon a world with countries with almost universal vaccine coverage, with countries with very little vaccine coverage because of affordability and lack of availability, lack of access. So that it is argued that IPR waiver might actually solve that. On the other hand, it has been pointed out that IPR waiver may thwart further investment in vaccine research and undermine long-term vaccine development. Let us discuss each of these arguments. The first argument has been contested, mostly by the pharma lobby. And they have stated that vaccine supply is not constrained by IPR, but by lack of manufacturing capacities. So waiving the IPR requirement may not necessarily augment supply, as technology transfer is a very complex process. So what they are suggesting is, even if you make the knowledge available to all, people will not be able to manufacture them, because getting the knowledge in the public domain is one thing, but being able to absorb that knowledge, absorb that technology, and put it to manufacturing is a very different ball game altogether. So what they are saying is, therefore, IPR waiver will actually will not be a solution. So some people further argue that instead of IPR waiver, one could invoke the compulsory licensing provisions to augment supply, and there is no need to waive IPR at all. A scrutiny of these arguments, contesting the demand for IPR waiver, according to me, reveal that they do not really hold much water, and there is urgent need to limit or eliminate the monopoly on vaccine technology. Now, why is that? First of all, none of the few monopoly holders of vaccine technology do have the manufacturing capacity to meet the vaccine demand to inoculate the entire global population within a short duration, and in order to contain the virus globally. We now know that the imperative is to inoculate people so that the vaccine, you stop the spread, you break the chain. The vaccine does not get an uninoculated body to spread and then to mutate and further spread. So if we want to do that, social isolation and whatever did not work to break the chain. So therefore, vaccine, universal vaccine, universal inoculation, not only within the boundaries of the country, but also globally, is required. Now, unless the monopoly rights are limited, there will always be incentive for the IPR holders to hoard the technology. They would not like to release the technology and have a vaccine supply at one go, because it's all a matter of demand and supply. So for imminent profit gains, they would like to release it slowly. So this hoarding is an inbuilt incentive that is there when you have a monopoly on your proprietary knowledge. So they will not let this be licensed, even if they don't have their own manufacturing capacity. They can license it to others, but they for far and wide to build manufacturing capacities to meet the global demand within a short duration. This will never be possible as long as there are monopoly rights. True, some licensing and tech transfer are taking place. We know AstraZeneca and Serum Institute, they have had a very successful technology transfer. But I would argue that this goes to show that the complexity of technology transfer is, over exaggerated. It's sort of overplayed a bit in this argument by the critics. So the government actually can compel the monopoly holders to share the knowledge wherever there are qualified manufacturers. There are qualified manufacturers across the globe, and it's if they all of them pull their efforts together to start manufacturing, given that the proprietary knowledge is shared and transferred, it would possibly be a scenario in the very near future to be able to produce that kind of volume of vaccines to inoculate the entire global population. Of course, needless to mention that companies holding patents and know-how must be adequately compensated for IPR waiver by means of royalties and subsidies. That goes without saying. But this incentive to augment and maximize profits through hoarding, will definitely not be in the interest of a global public good. So this will prevent the corporates from limiting immediate diffusion of their proprietary knowledge for profit maximization. And immediate diffusion is the need of the hour to tackle the pandemic by blocking the virus from spreading and persisting. Now we come to the second argument, which says that there is some merit, that in that second argument, which says that IPR waiver may jeopardize the pace of vaccine research and shall and stall the progress in this direction. Something that is crucially important at this juncture with the appearance of new variants of the virus resistant to the existing vaccines. So we must keep on progressing this knowledge flow to tackle the virus. And of course, it is clear that if you waive IPR, the private incentive to invest in this research will be thwarted. But my submission here is basically to go back to the age-old argument that knowledge, especially of the kind that we are talking about, new vaccine research, is a global public good, and therefore it cannot be left entirely to the market domain. National governments and international agencies must invest in knowledge and place it in the public domain. We cannot afford to stall the progress of science.
Professor Ray, can we have it conclude by 3 minutes?
Yeah, I'm not more than 1 minute.
Thank you.
So we cannot afford to stall the progress of science made in combating the pandemic, even if private investments cease to flow into research in this. So that would be my submission. So I would not buy the counter arguments or the pseudo counter arguments against the demand for IPR waiver. To conclude, despite such well-known public characters of health, increasingly over the last few decades, we have witnessed how the state in many countries has been slowly withdrawing from shouldering the burden of providing such merit goods like education and healthcare, leaving them to the private sector. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal SDG declarations in 2015, while setting bold targets to ensure, quote, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages, unquote, Goal 3, highlighted the need to rope in the private sector to meet all 17 SDGs. In fact, it mentions the word private sector in 16 times in this document, in this very brief document. So this goes completely against the WHO's Alma Ata mandate of the state's responsibility to look after the health of its citizens. The Alma Ata Declaration in 78 clearly stated, quote, governments have a responsibility for the health of their people, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate health and social measures. But states and supra-state agencies, unfortunately, seem to have forgotten this mandate. At this juncture, COVID appears as a rude reminder that health has a strong public good character and it cannot. Health and health research cannot be pushed exclusively to the private market domain. The state cannot abdicate its responsibilities. It is high time to bring back health and health research onto the main stage of government functions across the globe. Health must be treated as no less important for the safety, security, and freedom of its citizens than some of the pure public goods like national defense and law and order enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for, I think, sticking to the time. It's a very interesting argument. I will allow one question from the audience or those who are listening to this speech, because we don't have enough time. So just one question. Anybody? I have one question. So there are two questions. One question. Okay. I think if one observation or question from my side, I think I would, yeah, this is for an argument's sake. I think vaccination is a public good, but the generation of vaccine can be different. No? It can be treated as an input into a public service. So in that sense, I think there can be multiple ways of hiring that input for the provision of the public. So in that sense, can we think about multiple ways? Like, for example, a private company is coming out with an innovative vaccine, and there can be a joint joint research between a public and private agency. But when there are multiple vaccines to solve the problem, can there be a global governance coordination to buy and see that each and every individual is vaccinated? So in that sense, there can be a slight difference between the generation of vaccine and the vaccination process.
Well, I completely agree, actually, yes. I mean, there is a difference. In fact, what we have now is vaccines developed by pure private entities as well as by private public, partnership. Like AstraZeneca, as you know, is Oxford University, which is a public university with AstraZeneca. So, I mean, absolutely so, when we have, but the problem with this is once you get the vaccine, if heavy private investments have gone in, there would be tendencies to or incentives to maximize profits. And unless the governments and the international agencies rein in to check that, the idea is to vaccinate everybody. And therefore, withdrawing IPR, I'm never saying they do not compensate. Please do compensate, more than compensate. But the problem is if you are actually trying to, withhold supply and withhold manufacturing, you are limiting it to very few manufacturing facilities. We know that there will be not adequate supply to meet the demand, and the prices will continue to remain high, and that is the whole objective. So that's where intervention is required. I completely agree with you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I don't see anybody asking a question. I think that was a very insightful talk, and we could, I think, finish it exactly in time. So I request the faculty in charge to introduce Professor Devan.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Amit, sir, for that wonderful discussions. I now invite Professor Ritu Diwan, President, Indian Association of Women's Studies. So she'll be addressing
Please.
addressing us on the topic pandemic policy and patriarchy. Please, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and delighted to be here on this panel, because I think one of the most important areas for debate these days is the linkage between economics and law. And so therefore this is very important, very essential, and something we really need to take forward. I'm also delighted that the panel today is on our Constitution Day. And therefore, I don't know how one can wish anyone a happy constitution when there are several, withdrawals of rights. And that's really, in a way, what I would like to focus on. And it's not so much for me, as an economist, as somebody who's been working on this for ever since the pandemic started, including, financial analysis, etc., etc., and of course at the ground level, as many of us would have been doing after the most brutal lockdown that the world has ever witnessed. And I don't think we will ever recover from the sights of our own citizens trudging home over days and days and thousands of kilometers and miles. For me, it's much more the policy response to the pandemic and what it has done. The pandemic, of course, we know it's a problem. One's not denying all those issues, but that the pain of it and the impact of it could certainly have been mitigated. One or two, I think, have already been mentioned. That is treating health as a public good, which is something which is so very essential. And also certain other policies which have been insisted on, which have been passed on, and I must say in a somewhat unconstitutional manner, under the camouflage of COVID. So these and all of them seem to have impacted our, our preamble, our fundamental rights, the issues of justice, liberty, equality, very much so of gender, as well as of caste and religion and what has happened, and of course of fraternity. I'm not even getting into issues of freedom of speech, etc., etc. Now, when the pandemic struck, and which we all know, I'm not going to the whole history of the entire thing, but let us remember that our economy was already in a state of collapse. Our GDP was the lowest ever. The inequality levels were the highest ever. For the first time in 42 years, the population, the percentage of population below the poverty line had actually increased by over 4.5%. And this is something which is recorded. It's recorded officially, it's recorded unofficially in many other kinds of analysis. Your industry is working at only 40% capacity. We already had the lowest monthly wage in all of South Asia at 4,200 rupees. We had a falling work participation rate, particularly the female work participation rate, again, is one of the lowest in the world, in fact, and declining at a very, very dramatic level. Nutrition, already 76%, and this is all before the pandemic. Let's remember, 76% of rural households could not have a nutritional diet. And we know the NFHS data, which was released just day before in the evening, that in fact the extent of anemia, undernutrition amongst women and infants has been increasing in the last 5 or 6 years, and very much so during the last year. And of course, there are many other aspects which in detail I will not be able to get into. But let us remember that we had already fallen on all the indices. At every SDG level, we had fallen on the Global Hunger Index, on the number of nourished children and stunted and wasted children. That proportion had increased. The numbers, of course, but the proportion very much so. Inequality index, our gender inequality index, our gender wage gap is one of the highest in the entire world. Environment performance, water, air quality, press freedom, and of course, already the downgrading 2 years ago of our economy from our country from a democracy to a flawed democracy. I think this is something where it's not only problematic, but something which we have all been struggling with in our own way. And then comes the pandemic and a policy response which doesn't care for the majority of the citizens. I mean, that you can declare a lockdown of more than a month in just 4 hours is unimaginable. It's really I just don't know how divorced the dispensations are from the lived reality of the majority of the people, where 1/3 of our country is made up of migrants. Of course, the fall in GDP all over again. And during this period, when your GDP is falling, your unemployment is huge. The number of men and women who lost jobs, of course, one can't see women only in isolation from the overall reality. There's a lot of documentation which has been done. No macro data, no national data. But I think the work which APU, I mean, Dr. Shantakumar is here, Azim Premji University or SWAN or CMI or a whole lot of us independent researchers have done on the issues of employment, the non-payment of wages to workers in terms of arrears which were there, which were not paid. And of course, within this issue is also the fact that the majority of the companies, and this is studies which have been done. I mean, I was horrified when I came across this, and I did and corrected the entire data, collected it again and analyzed it again, that in fact the top listed manufacturing companies in India actually increased their profit during the pandemic, first by 20% in the first few months, and then to 36 to 38%. And this is when you have more than, I think, 2/3 of your workers, or 97% of our workers are informal workers, all of them out of jobs with no wages at all. And the impact, of course, on women and on transgenders and on sexual minorities has been absolutely the worst. There's quite a significant amount of data. I've been working, others have been working, and you know, the extent of I think the extent of lack of compassion or the depth of compassion in the relief package which was offered, or what we call the pandemic response policy which was offered, is cruel. I mean, absolutely, to say the least. And I have come across, and many of us have come across, I mean, workers in, it's been widely reported in academic journals, not only in newspapers, that women working for 8 hours at 15 rupees, all right? A sex worker charging 7 rupees an encounter. I mean, this is the level to which people were left destitute. And please, let's remember, these are people who had already been left destitute by the policy of demonetization, where they had taken away their savings, their provident funds, whatever assets they had already been sold, where they had still not recovered. Now, not only is there no universal basic income or a cash transfer which is given, but there is no other kind of support which is there. So, you know, when you work with migrant workers and you tell them use sanitizer, and their answer is there's no money to eat. Where do we buy sanitizer from? Wash your hands. There's no water available, and there's no money to buy even a piece of soap. So what really do you do in this kind of a situation? And that's why the issue of health as a public good is something which is very, very important. Apart from the fact, of course, that health is the major, or the expenditure, the private expenditure on health is the main reason why families fall into poverty. And now to even get out of that poverty syndrome is going to be much, much more difficult in a situation where I think it's estimated at about 90 million people, plus another 40 million from the middle class, who have slid below the poverty line, which we know itself is extremely limited. I'm not going to go into you know, huge details. There's a lot of information which is available, a lot which has been written, but there are 3 or 4 things I'd like to very much mention here before I come into 1 or 2 other particular aspects. And that is, of course, the fact that midday meals were stopped. So except for 1 or 2 states where you had home delivery of at least the dry rations, the children not only not immunized, but not even getting enough. I think the calculation is about 63% of children, that's 2/3, did not even get the dry rations which were to be distributed. Food was given, that 5 kilos of rice and wheat or whatever, but a lot of it depended on card conditionalities. We tried raising it with, all the powers that be in Delhi or wherever this was being done from. And it was only in 1 or 2 areas at the state level where we succeeded, and we said, please give the food without any cards. And remember, some of these cards are unconstitutional. They're still not validated at all levels by the Supreme Court of India. Also, ICDS closed. We know that all the ICDS were closed in most of the issues. The focus of health went on into COVID, which was very important, but at the cost of many other illnesses. So actually, one had to go to court on the issue of continuing subsidies for medicines like TB, which is much, much more rampant, and which is historically, I mean, India is a capital of TB in the world. Also, you had an increase in, and this has been recorded across several states, in the infant mortality rate, in the maternal mortality rate, unsafe abortions, which are there, and what I call collateral inequalities, which have actually increased very, very much so, for the lack of a, it's not only a sensitive policy, it's a policy which needs to see the reality of the people of your own country. All right. And therefore, you have this huge increase in child marriages. And that's one of the SDGs which we were attaining over a period of time, but that now we are going to be missing by many, many years, if not by decades, because there's no sensitization of policies to these issues. Of course, shadow pandemic, I mean, that's a new term which has come, and the shadow pandemic is that of domestic violence, and the kind of domestic violence, whether it's from work from home or it is a non-allocation of resources to fight. If you see the budget of last year, which is called the never before budget, which I call the never again budget, and I hope that kind of a budget never comes, that all allocations for protection of people, women, from domestic violence, that was reduced. Health, in fact, health budget was a lot of fudging, because there were roads and well-being and several other kinds of aspects which were attached to the concept of health as a public good. And also what you had, and this is a relief packages which focused only on the supply side. So where the majority of the people, including women, are concerned, there was absolutely no kind of a support. That demand concept, or the consumption concept, which is so essential, that people are the ones who constitute the market, that they need to be given, whether it is food or whether it is cash transfers, whether it is fees, whether it is basic mobiles to be accessing online education, and across the board decrease in public provisioning at all levels, apart from health, at every single level, including gender, including Narega. I mean, that's your whole issue of migration and the reverse migration which took place. And you had people and women, of course, losing out on competing for these very pathetic jobs of 100 and 200 rupees a month, which also they were not given on a regular basis. Now, the argument which is given is that there is not enough money. And as an economist, I totally do not agree. I think, first of all, fiscal deficit, or maintaining the fiscal deficit, is not an issue at all where a pandemic or a national disaster like this is concerned. To focus on maintaining a deficit and to contain revenue expenditure is something which is not acceptable in economic terms, or in ethical terms, or even in constitutional terms. And there was enough money, I mean, if you just see the kind of money which is being spent, or the money which is being raised, our salaries in universities were cut and given to a central care fund, which has no validity, no constitutional validity. You have money, loans which have come. I mean, just yesterday was 300 or 400 billion, I think, dollars loan which was given for vaccines, even though we're supposed to have a surplus of vaccines, and that we are exporting We exported, and we're still exporting vaccines in the name of diplomacy or whatever term which is being used. Monetization, the sale of assets at very, very cheap levels, which is going on in the last 2 or 3 months. So there's a lot of money which is being raised. And of course, you have other wasteful expenditure, and what I would call it a criminal expenditure like rebuilding parliament or the central vista, etc., etc. 65,000 crores. I mean, this is not the time to spend on this. It's the time to give universal basic income and support for another serious period of at least a year or so. Under this entire issue of the pandemic and how it impacts the people and how it impacts women in particular, and sexual minorities, very much so, the vulnerable, the minorities, the OBCs, the Dhangas, the nomads, the Dalits, the poorest of the poor, the economically and vulnerable at every level, economically, politically, socially. I mean, you take them at whichever definition one wants to take. You have two very important ordinances which are passed. One, of course, has been withdrawn, and that is the Farm Acts. I will not get into in detail on that. The other, which is still operative and which takes away a lot of the rights from our constitution and impacts all workers, particularly women, are the labor codes. You have these 4 labor codes where all the labor laws are repealed. Now, to say that all forms of reform in courts is good, it depends on who the reforms are being done for. So the beginning of the labor code says that these reforms are for the ease of doing business, not to protect the rights of the workers, whether it's male workers or female workers or those of any other gender. So your code on wages replaces 4 laws. The code on occupational safety replaces 13 laws. Code 3 on social security replaces 15 laws. And your code 4 on industrial relations repeals all the laws which are there for freedom of association. So here what you have is a redefining of the concept of work, worker, and workplace. And the limitation of the concept of worker, and this applies particularly very much so to women workers, is that worker is now to be defined as somebody who's employed in an establishment. So your private household employment or your other kinds of employment, there you're not considered a worker, and that's not considered a workplace. So domestic workers, Tamil Nadu, you have your Sumangali workers who are very much now out of the definition of worker. And of course, you, apart from domestic workers, and this your home-based workers, which is where a large number of women and the poor, of course, the men and the women are employed. I'm not even getting into other laws which have been passed in 2 or 3 states under the cover of COVID. Again, changing the laws which are there, the international laws which are there, and the ILO laws, I think, to which we have signed. We've signed several covenants and ratified all these issues, and that is primarily even in relation to hours of work, because what the labor codes do is they increase the hours of work from 8 to 12, and under emergency production situations, in quote emergency, those hours of work can be extended to 16. I mean, how any human can do physical work for 16 hours without a break is something which I have no answer for that. But what it also does, please let's remember, this is the time to increase employment and not decrease it. By increasing the hours of work from 8 to 12, you're denying one entire shift of workers. Okay, you're 24 divided by 8 and you're 24 divided by 12. Also, what these laws do is that they do not cover the issues of sexual harassment at workplace. And this, we know, the NCRB data has again just been released, that there's been a massive rise in violence against women. And this is something which should have been much, much stronger. But in fact, it has been delimited and it has been disconnected from the concept of safety at the workplace, which is there. And of course, if you see the budgets which have been passed, that your allocations on these one-stop centers, etc., are virtually zero, or they've come down by 30 to 40%. In fact, what we call a gender budget analysis, it has been actually reduced by 26% in the last budget instead of actually increasing it because of
Mrs. Devan, shall I request you to
2 minutes.
in 3 minutes finish your
Oh,
conclude your
okay.
presentation in
2 minutes.
3 minutes time?
So, yeah. So these are the issues. Also, when social security is something which is so essential, the code on social security says that workers will get social security when and when the government deems it necessary. I'm quoting from the code, deems it necessary, and when it may constitute or design social security measures, not will. So you see, the wording becomes not that the state is responsible, that it must do this, but it may do this. So therefore, even the issue of social security becomes extremely problematic. I'm not even getting into issues of living wages, bare necessity, social upliftment, education, etc., etc. But what the fourth code does, and this thing goes against the very concept of what India is and what our constitution is, and that is takes away the right of forming a union, the right to form an association, and the right to dissent. And if this is the fundamentals of our democracy and they're not being given to us, it's something I think we really need to debate on this very important day. And as part of academics, as part of our advocacy, and many of us who have been activists at the ground level in the last 2 years of the pandemic, or maybe even since demonetization, it's something we really need to reconsider very, very seriously. Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Devan. I think it was a very interesting talk. I think I request people to ask questions. Let me read out a few questions or maybe rephrase the question. Do you think that the COVID has sort of aggravated government failure? No, can we say that it's more of a government failure? The issues are more related to the government failure?
Yes, absolutely. I think you got the essence of the thing. It's the lack of a compassionate policy and a lack of a sensitive policy benefiting the majority of our citizens in our country. And that's why the impact is, the impact in Bangladesh is much less. The impact in Pakistan is much, much less than what is there. In fact, Bangladesh saw a huge increase in GDP, even in the first year. The GDP increased in a positive manner, where ours fell by 50% and not by the 23%, 24%, because you have to take the formal sector, which is 9/10 of our workers and our production into account.
There's another interesting question about, why do we see a kind of a share market boom even immediately after
I agree.
the pandemic?
Yes, because please see that the two richest men in our country, one of which has overtaken the other, increased their profits by 39%. Increase. And this is something which, as an economist, is really shocking for us. The inequality, of course, we have enough reports which have brought out the inequality component, which has increased very dramatically. But the fact of that you are able to increase profits, including the booming of the share market, at the same time when the share of wages has fallen in an equivalent proportion. So I think this just shows the essential inequality which exists in our country, and it's something I think we should be utterly ashamed of. I don't know what other word to use.
Let me take
At
this
least the state should be ashamed of it.
Let me take this opportunity to give a counter view just for the argument's sake. If you look at globally, many poorer countries are not that affected by the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
Whether it is in terms of the number of infections or number of deaths and so on. I used to say that even within India, one can say that probably some of the better performing states are also affected due to COVID pandemic. For example, currently Kerala continues to have the higher number of infections. So can we really say that the governance is an issue, or is there could be some underlying reasons why probably better governed states or probably better performing states and societies also face serious issues in this?
Yes, I agree. There are 2 points here which I would like to raise in relation to the point which you have raised. One is that Maharashtra and Kerala are the 2 worst impacted, okay, which we know. I'm Maharashtra, so I know what we really went through. And please remember, when all these migrants were walking on the road, There were planes which were bringing back those who were living abroad back into the country. Kerala and Maharashtra saw the maximum number of planes and the maximum number of passengers. And at that time, there was no policy whatsoever imposed, recommended by the center to test those people who were coming. So all these people who landed went to whichever places which they had to go. So yet Kerala, it reported a very high level of infections, but also because they were doing amazingly high testing. I think that is something which was very important, and the governance. And when we talk about the governance issue, two levels. One is at the center, and this is again a constitutional issue. GST, the distribution of GST funds, which were not done in time by the center. There's a huge amount which is still pending, and this affects your developmental funding in the long run, because the states are constrained with very low levels of revenue and they are not allowed to raise more. I mean, even the issue of alcohol, day before yesterday, Maharashtra changed its alcohol policy because of the whole funding issue. And GST, let's remember, is again, like I said, a constitution. The center gets so much, the state gets so much, and the center is constitutionally bound to deliver that money and transfer that money in time equally to the states. So 7, 8 states were given, but they were the ones who were, in alignment with the center, to put it in a very mild kind of manner.
Okay, Professor Diwan, I think that was a very interesting talk, and we had some interesting discussion also around that, and I think we are happy that we could finish it exactly on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I request the faculty coordinator to introduce the third speaker. A very short introduction, please.
Thank you, Professor Pivan, for that very interesting topic highlighting the patriarchal aspect of policy in pandemics. Now I request Professor Chinmay Tumbe, Faculty, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. She mainly teaches urban economics and business environment. So she'll be addressing us on the topic. He'll be addressing us on the topic, the age of pandemics, 1870 to 1920, and how they shaped India and the world.
Professor Tumbe, 22 minutes, is that fine?
Yeah, more than enough. Yeah. But you'll have to still remind me in 2 minutes before.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So I have a few slides to share. So let me just do that. Great. Can you see this and can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to talk about pandemics of the past and try and shed some light on the current pandemic and how we see that. Unfortunately, not of too much of help in the sense of the conference theme, law and economics, but hopefully give you some sense of how pandemics have been viewed in the past and so on. This book came out last year at a time when India was not very badly hit by the pandemic yet. Unfortunately, now India is one of the worst affected countries in the pandemic, both in terms of excess deaths per capita, a topic on which I currently work, as well as income loss, on which Professor Ritu Diwan just eloquently spoke. Let me just point out that many of the things we say were unprecedented, etc., have happened in the past. For example, the migration crisis, which happened last year, also happened during the plague in 1897. Very similar visuals, except at that time, the trains ran, and last year the trains did not run, or rather the Shramik trains were introduced 40 days or 2 months too late. What's interesting is that India was battered by pandemics in the past, and it's a memory which has completely gone out of our public consciousness, which I believe has really hurt us badly out here. And there's a lot that we can learn from past pandemics. For example, in this chart, the British had the exact policy trade-off to make. Should we shut down the Indian railways or not? Should we protect people by not letting the disease spread, or should we allow migrants to go home because it's simply not feasible to clamp down on internal migration in India? And the British, for all the other faults, took the view that shutting down the railways would lead to more crisis. And in their wisdom, they allowed special trains. Migrants went back. And of course, 6 months later, they came back to Bombay. This is the scene from Bombay. Unfortunately, in 2020, we had a migration crisis in which the trains were shut down with the 4-hour notice period. And arguably, if this knowledge was known from the past, arguably, if we had known about the Chinese plague of 1911, in which they had also shut down the railways and also got a humanitarian crisis, this is not something that would have been done last year. Other things that we learn from past pandemics is the obvious fact that pandemics come in waves. This chart on the bottom is reported COVID deaths. It is only reported because a lot of it is not reported. Cholera, as you can see, over 70 years came in many waves. Plague for a 25-year period, peak 1907. When it first came in 1896, 97, people thought the worst was over. It came back again and again and again for many, many years. 12 years after it broke out, it claimed 1 million lives in 1907. And the most deadly one of them all, influenza, came in two waves. You can see the first wave, April, May 1918, and then the deadly killer wave, which happened in late 1918, which took millions of lives. So if you look at 2021 with 1918, you see a remarkable similarity in the shock to all-cause mortality. What you see is that basically what we've seen in 2021 is India's largest shock. It is India's largest mortality crisis since 1918. That is what we've all witnessed earlier this year. We've not seen any incident in any year since 1918 of a shock as bad as this. And just like 1918, what we've got also is an economic crisis. The two worst years of economic history of India, if you look at GDP growth and inflation, last 120 years, the two worst years of Indian economic history have both been pandemic years. 1918, the influenza year, and 2020, the year of the sharp lockdown, which contracted the Indian economy by about 8%. Thankfully, we don't have inflation of about 30%, which was raging in 1918. But it just, again, goes to tell you how important understanding economic history is, because if this is a conference on law and economics, we often tend in economics to learn about events like financial crises, Great Depression. But in Indian history, the two worst years in the last 20 years have not been financial crisis or the Great Depression. It has really been pandemics. So in this book, I look at different aspects of pandemics. I'm just going to give you a flavor of that in the next 15, 20 minutes. But I argue that this period in Indian history has remarkably been forgotten. We tend to focus on other stuffs and other isms like nationalism, capitalism, imperialism, and so on. But pandemics was the big elephant in the room. The day-to-day life of Indians in this time period, just like in 2020, 21, was all about pandemics. It's like talking 100 years later about 2021 as being very important in terms of some sort of an arcane policy that happened. We know as we live through this period that our number one enemy is the virus. The number one constraint we face is because of pandemic, and that's how Indians lived their lives in this particular period. Remarkably, it's also a period which is remarkably absent from our history textbooks. A lot of complaints about our textbooks of late, but this is a huge gap. 1918 killed 20 million people in the influenza pandemic. It's India's worst demographic disaster, and it doesn't figure in any history textbook that I've seen so far. And I do believe that one of the reasons we've been so badly hit in this pandemic is because we've had absolutely no understanding of what hit us in the past. To give you a sense of what happened back then, in about 100 years, over 70 million people died. Cholera, plague, and influenza devastated the world. India was the principal or the epicenter in each of those pandemics, and it continues to be so even today, in the sense that COVID-19 has claimed more lives in India than any other country in the world when you measure numbers by excess deaths and not reported COVID-19 statistics. Just to quickly go over some of these diseases, cholera started in eastern India, an unusually virulent strain which spread out much of the subcontinent. No railways, no steamships. It took time to get around, but it overruns the Indian subcontinent in a couple of years, goes around the world in different waves. But by the 1830s, it has entrenched itself in Europe, North America, and by the end of the century, there's a whole period in Latin American history about cholera. Marquez wrote a famous book called Love in the Time of Cholera, which gives you a sense of how this disease, which emerged from Eastern India, went around the world. Also useful corrective, because a lot of people think pandemics never originated in India, or all pandemics started in China and so on. But this is a classic case where this disease was actually called Indian cholera. And for about 100 years, India was seen in negative light around the world, precisely because of this pandemic. This is just to give you a sense of the disease, sunken faces, dehydration, as we now know, is this cause. Very simple to treat it today, but for about 150 years, nobody really knew what was hitting them. And a cartoon which kind of tells you how scared people were of cholera. A classic example of the economic impact of cholera. This is from USA, where cholera broke out in particular years, also taking the life of an American president after he stepped out of office. In this particular image, this person says, you'll have to come down with your rents. I intend to occupy these premises myself. An important aspect of all pandemics of the past, all deadly pandemics of the past, including this one, is migrant flight. Migrant flight is one of the most stylized fact of pandemics, simply because people want to get the safety of home and go back, typically from cities. And that is why urban real estate markets, migration labor markets are deeply affected in every pandemic of the past. And so to say stuff like we didn't anticipate what was happening after the lockdown last year was very problematic if you had seen what has happened in past pandemics, because this is the one thing which we know happens in all pandemics, is the urge to go back home. In cholera, Egypt was actually the most affected country in per capita terms, not India, but India lost millions of people in absolute terms. Russia was hugely affected as well. This is an example of early social distancing that you can see on this bridge. But quarantines, the huge legacy of that period. And much of the word lockdown was not used, but the word quarantine was very much in vogue. And the art of quarantines was perfected in this particular time period. Many of the debates we have today, lives versus livelihoods, for instance, keep recurring throughout the 19th century, because this hard trade-off of shutting down economic activity vis-a-vis letting the disease spread, kept manifesting itself again and again. And it's important to note that the British Empire was all for laissez-faire market economies and pushed for less quarantines, and the other empires, French, German, pushed for more quarantines. And there was a tussle between the two. But there's no doubt that quarantines did work in containing many of these diseases, and the lack of such quarantines in many places of India hurt India especially hard. Give a sense of how cholera's transmission debates. It was waterborne disease. People thought it was airborne. Important to understand transmission of disease in any pandemic. Classic example of how an Indian officer was trying to tell his superiors in India that cholera is waterborne. In this map, it's a caste level map in village India. And he points out that in one side of the street where the so-called high caste live, the wells were contaminated. And because the other people do not drink this water, they were not contracting cholera. Classic example of using a particular map and India's social inequality gradient to understand the properties of the disease in itself. While cholera was understood to be waterborne in the 1850s in UK, its application in India took almost 5 decades. So, but for about 5 decades, India was following the wrong scientific paradigm of what caused cholera. And it's only when piped water started coming slowly that cholera, some control over cholera happened. Vaccination is a huge part of India's story today. This gentleman in the picture is very important, Valdemar Haffkine. Arguably, if Haffkine had never come to India, we would not have got the Serum Institute of India today. There's a nice path dependency from the age of pandemics of the past to what we are seeing today. Today, we are blessed to have one of the world's largest vaccine manufacturers in our country. That puts our vaccination efforts, hugely ahead of many other countries at a similar level per capita income. It so happens that Haffkine was very instrumental in setting up and starting up a lot of India's vaccination drive. And eventually, the Serum Institute was born when the horse breeder family of Poonawallas, interacted with the Haffkine Institute in Bombay, and then eventually backward integrated into vaccine manufacturing. So there's a nice link. And the Haffkine Institute, just like the Serum Institute today, was very instrumental in popularizing the vaccine against cholera and also plague. Just like the Serum Institute will soon start resuming its exports, the world was counting on India to make and export its vaccines 100 years back. So again, the story of India as the vaccine hub of the world has a very long history. Cholera was eventually won by understanding the science. John Snow figured out the transmission. Robert Koch identified the bacteria. Leonard Rogers understood the intravenous treatment. And finally, an Indian scientist, Sambhunath Dey, who ought to have won the Nobel Prize, actually figured out what is cholera, after which better vaccination and finally oral rehydration therapy was invented. Move on to plague, which is a disease which scared the hell out of people. This is the classic response, prayers, just like we had Go Corona Go. This is a classic example of prayers trying to keep plague away from Bombay. Very harsh measures. I use this photograph to point out, especially in a conference on law and economics, the legislation under which we operate today, the Epidemic Disease Act, the year is 1897. So it was introduced to combat plague. We are dealing with coronavirus in the same way that we dealt with plague. There have, of course, been some changes in the act, but very few. And that act came about from a very top-down surveillance kind of an attitude of the British, which led to some serious human rights violations. This is just to give you a sense of disinfection of a person when none of this actually mattered in curing plague. These were just thoughts out there. But the British basically intervened in the daily lives of people, and they encountered a massive backlash back then, including assassinations and whatnot. But again, a classic example of how a very, very harsh law can affect economic activity and not control the pandemic, because this law actually in 1897 did not eventually control the pandemic. The pandemic raged on for 25 more years, and they had to dilute the law. More importantly, have other public health measures which kind of got this disease under control. So the law itself, the efficacy of the law is highly debatable, and it's a very important point because we're using the same law even today to fight the virus. I'm going to skip some pictures. Just there's a slight discussion right now before I started on why some parts of the world are more affected by a disease than others. And the plague kind of story is very important because if you look at where plague affected India, it affected only a few parts of India. And the officials in Madras and Calcutta often boasted, saying we have plague under control. But we now know that it was not, a good policy, but basically plain good luck. Why a disease happens in one place and not the other has, a huge number of reasons. In the case of plague, it was about the rat ecology, the rat flea ecology, which mattered. Just like in COVID, we're realizing having a huge share of older population matters in terms of overall intensities. Having colder climates, having more air conditioning, indoor, a circulation of air matters in the circulation of virus. Why the rich countries were more affected in the last 2 years compared to the poor countries is often now pinned down to at least 2 or 3 knowns, and of course a lot of unknowns. One being older populations, two being better reporting standards, which is hugely important, and 3 in terms of air conditioning and living in indoor kind of environments. In contrast, if you see what's happening in India today, within India, there's a constant blame game as to why COVID-19 affects some parts of India and not others. Why is it affecting Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Kerala? I've been looking at this very closely for the last 1 year. I can tell you that that's not the case. If you look at seroprevalence, COVID-19 has gone all over India. Its biggest impact has been in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, in terms of deaths. It's a complete lie that states like Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Kerala, which are very high on the reported standards, on reporting. Just because they're doing a good job in reporting it doesn't mean that the pandemic has affected those places more. The impact of the pandemic in India is completely different from what the government of India has been saying in terms of the reported statistics. And we have a paper coming out in a journal which shows you that. Some other stuff on certificates and so on. Plague was eventually won over again by a lot of investment in science. Savitribai Phule famously was in the died of plague, but she was also started a plague clinic. The other gentleman here figured out the science and transmission. But plague as a disease did not quite go out by human ingenuity. It went out most likely due to herd immunity among rodents. Human ingenuity in terms of antibiotics, vaccines came much later after the pandemic had pretty much receded. It's a case of a pandemic which human beings actually did not quite end while it was raging at its peak, but many decades later. But today, of course, we say plague is not very dangerous, both plague and cholera being bacteria-based. Finally, influenza, which was the most deadly of them all, killed 20 million of people in India, 6% of India's population wiped out. Very deadly. But when the numbers first came in Times of India in March 1919, they said 6 million deaths. We later realized, the census officials, when people went to the villages and so on, they realized how big the number was. Most estimates now place it between 15 and 20 million. And I use this again to point out that the number of 450,000 that the government of India gives is a serious underestimate of how many people have died in India, a topic which we've been working. I'll skip some of this. This is an interesting advertisement of how to prevent influenza. Just to point out again how much of this is relevant today. You'll see the mask, which was prevalent in 1918, but look at all the stuff that's now become popular in 2021, which did not get attention in 2020. For example, ventilation. Ventilation has now become a huge part of public health surveillance. It was not really a big deal in 2020. Again, telling you how many things that have happened in the past, have a relevance today. So in this book, there's a huge part covering a wide ground. But if you look at legacies, most important being the creation of the WHO. WHO's creation was in 1948, but its intellectual origins lie in 1851 when they were trying to stop cholera from reaching Europe from India. So the age of pandemics gave birth to the WHO, which now kind of monitors the pandemic closely. But in India, we had huge legacies. For example, the law itself, the law we use for the COVID started in the age of pandemics. Vaccine development, as I mentioned, new outlook on urban development started during the plague, and three big movements of the early 20th century, the cooperative movement, the labor movement, and the freedom movement, also had huge things to do with the pandemic. For the simple reason, the pandemic killed so many people that labor actually got increasing bargaining power. It's not a coincidence that it's after 1918 that India's labor movement picks off in a huge way. The Royal Commission of Labor, a decade later, noted the influenza pandemic as the inflection point after which labor started getting a lot of rights and so on. That's not the case with COVID-19. The overall mortality is not as big. It's not 6% of India's population as it was in 1918. But a freedom movement as well. Whether you look at 1857 uprising on the back of a raging cholera epidemic, whether you look at the rise of the Congress Party and its split against the backdrop of the plague epidemic, and whether you look at the rise of Gandhi along the backdrop of the 1918 influenza. Right? So a variety of things in Indian history that can be connected with the age of pandemics. So with that, I'll end and be happy to take questions. I'll just point out that we have this new work on the current pandemic, which estimates 3 million deaths. That puts India on par with Latin American countries at 2,000 per million kind of excess death kind of rate, which kind of tells you that India, unfortunately, even today, is now the worst affected, not the worst, but one of the worst affected countries in the world in terms of lives, if you proxy by GDP loss, and livelihoods when you livelihoods when you think of GDP, and lives when you think about excess deaths, which is unfortunate. I say because a lot of the things, whether it was shutting down trains, which I think was a bad idea, whether it was the hubris that was experienced between January and March earlier this year, thinking that the pandemic is over, assuming that we have natural immunity when we did not really know the science well enough last year. And again, the sense of hubris that seems to be settling in just as the nth wave is arriving in Europe and America. Pandemics don't usually get over in 1 year. They take a lot of time, they come in waves, and this book ends with the words patience and humility, which is, I think, what is really needed in dealing with the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was very insightful. Now, let me take this opportunity to ask one question. There is, globally, we would expect some improvement in the technology of governance, deepening of democracy, some kind of society-wide acquisition of capabilities, etc. So, do you see some kind of evidence of that happening in dealing with pandemics, not only from India, but also world over? What
Yes.
are the aspects where what we are doing well?
Certainly. I mean, the fact that we have a vaccine in record time is a classic example. This has never happened in any pandemic before, that you got a vaccine in the time of the raging pandemic, which actually works. We know this vaccine works tremendously well, at least against the variants that we know about right now. And it cuts down mortality. It will not, people often think with the vaccination, the pandemic will get over. That's not what the vaccines do. The idea of vaccination is to bring down deaths. We will continuously get cases, but as long as we break the relationship between cases and deaths, which is what vaccination does, and that is a huge and very rapid breakthrough that happened due to, of course, a lot of cooperation from scientists from across the world, WHO, private companies, university laboratories, government support, like in the case of India. It's been a tremendous effort in record time to get a vaccine. But the larger question, does science and technology necessarily reduce the intensity of pandemics? The answer is simply no. We can never eliminate pandemics. All we can do is understand and eradicate them. To give you an example, in 1917, you had a medical conference kind of, praising themselves, saying in the last 50 years, they had managed to understand tuberculosis, they had managed to understand plague, they had managed to understand cholera. And the scientists in 1917 were fairly happy with the tremendous progress that the age of bacteriology or the bacteriological revolution had done in the late 19th and early 20th century. And boom, the next year comes the influenza, and 40 million plus people are dead. Right? So you never really know what's around the corner. All you can do is improve surveillance systems, improve better ways of having restrictions, there's no doubt you need to have restrictions. Otherwise, you're going to have mass mortality. But how do you do those restrictions without having the economic consequences of what Professor Ritu Devan pointed out? So having adequate social security nets, allowing migrant workers to go back home before announcing the lockdown, for instance. These are simple ways in which restrictions can be brought about. But there's simply no saying that science and technology necessarily improves. I mean, 1918 is the classic counter to that argument that just because science and technology is improving over time in certain ways, pandemic intensity needs to be need to be reduced. There's still a lot we don't know about COVID-19, and that is why I think countries around the world are still struggling to grapple with it. But what government should do is honestly admit where we stand. And unfortunately, in India, I don't see that. I've been part of this whole effort to bring out the story of deaths. And we're really lacking there. If we actually think 450,000 people in India died, when the number we are seeing is more than 2.5 million, seven times more than what the government thinks. We need to have a national inquiry on what went wrong and what can we do to not ensure that these things happen. Because if you look at the plague charts and so on, this might well be the beginning of a long drawn pandemic. Right? We think that this is over. This is not over by any yardstick. And pandemics of the past tell you, you really need to understand the science properly. We really don't understand too much of COVID-19 even today. So the good thing, to answer your question, the good thing has been the vaccination. And in very record time, we're able to bring down mortality rates. But we've still not understood transmission very well. And all what we learned from past pandemics, unless you understand transmission fully, you simply don't know how to control the pandemic. And that's where we are stuck. So we've done some progress. Cholera, for instance, we understood prevention. We realized clean water, you can cut down cholera. Right? So we understood transmission, we cut down cholera. We understood the rat flea ecology of plague, we brought down plague. With COVID-19, we're still fumbling as to, does humidity matter? Is it seasonal? Still big questions on which we don't have answers.
Can you please go through that chat box? I think there is one question by Dr. Renita.
Yeah. Right. I mean, is there an excuse to be caught without given the recurrence of pandemics in India, as given by history, does India and the world have any excuse to be caught without the vaccine? So obviously, this is a new disease. The vaccine has just come on board. There's a huge amount of literature on vaccine inequity. Obviously, many countries ought to be having the vaccine earlier. But I'll also say the best way to overcome vaccine hesitancy, to speak, is unfortunately to get the disease. Right? Across the world, the countries which have been hit hard have been scrambling for the vaccine. Right? And that is the brutal reality of this. India's vaccination drive was very slow before the second wave. And then it has become a life and death issue, and that's how it's ramped up. Now, that is a challenge as to how do you overcome this tremendous vaccine hesitancy which seems to be surfacing around the world. And for that, you need very good public communication. It's not enough to have the vaccine. In fact, there are a lot of stuff in my book which also tells you about vaccine hesitancy of the past. There was a vaccine scandal. People were not taking the plague vaccine seriously. All this stuff has also happened in the past. But you need very good, clear communication, demonstration effects, political leaders taking the vaccines, which is still not happening in India in many places. And that's why.
Professor Santakumar, can I frame my question, please?
Sure. Yeah.
Professor Santakumar, Chair, can I?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is Dr. Anita.
Yes.
So, Mr. Chinmay, I mean, amazing work. My question is not vaccine hesitancy. My question is, having had this experience, historical experience, maybe not hit upon the vaccine, like you said, that we've done a good job in a year reaching, to the cracking the code. But having had this historical experience, do we have any excuse to say that, we didn't have that particular vaccine? So my point is, can there not be a global fund in line with what the previous speaker spoke, wherein without any profits, there is this, there's just this scientific estimation of what can happen, and work for research and to protect lives. If that can just go on and on and on at the level that everything else seems to be going, like going to the space and going to everything,
Fair enough. I think what you're saying is, can we have also in anticipation, right? I think that is key in terms as opposed to reaction. My take on this is very simple. If you look at the history of epidemiology, virus, and so on, you can, of course, have a massive fund on trying to understand diseases which we still don't know very well. Malaria now, something has just come out last month and so on. But the fact is, we know bacteria-based diseases much better than viral diseases. That's a basic scientific fact. And on viral diseases, that is why we are very comfortable today with cholera and plague, because we have antibiotics, we have a lot of things to do with bacteria. But with viral disease, there's still a lot of unknown. So we're not at a stage where we can really declare or even start anticipating, because the way mutations and so on work, for example, today's newspaper is talking about a completely new variant which has come up. We are basically, it's like the police and the thief, in the sense, you can't expect a society with absolutely no murders or no thefts. The police tries to be one step ahead of the game, but a lot of it is going to be reaction. That is, after something has happened, how quickly do you catch the thief, and how quickly do you not let society be affected by it? And essentially, I think this is the game that's being played out. So I don't think the Global Fund and so on are fantastic ideas, to pool in resources, to also help, understand diseases which don't get attention usually in normal times. I think that's also a big issue. But it is something which can happen any point of time. 500 years later, you could still have pandemics. It's as I said, you can not eliminate pandemics. You can just try and reduce the intensity of it by certain measures. So we have to kind of understand that reality. And that's why history is important, because it tells us that it can happen anytime. And that is why it kind of tells, because the reason this book was written last year, the project started in March 2020, because in March 2020, I was just amazed at the conversation in India in particular, which said stuff like, "Oh, nothing can happen to us," which was pretty much the reaction until the second wave hit us, that nothing can happen to us. There have been no pandemics in the past, all pandemics from China. It was just bizarre, given the fact that India was the most affected country for about 100 years, right? And so that is why the book project, in fact, was born.
Thank you very much. I think that was great. I think we could have a very useful discussion. Thank you all. I think thanks. I'm thanking organizers to put together this panel and for having this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Santakumar.
Congratulations. It was a very terrific presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chinmay, sir, for that very multidisciplinary approach from economics to history to socio-legal perspectives of this topic. That was a very engaging session. And with this, we come to the end of this roundtable discussions. I thank Professor Shantakumar for very patiently being here and asking all the precise questions and also keeping up with the time. Thank you so much, sir. And also I thank all the presenters for that insightful afternoon, and also for all the participants who were very active in the session. So thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you.